The Dyslexia Duo wants to know, do you want to get your name out there? Well, we can help you gain brand awareness. We build better brands simply by taking your own vision for your business and helping it reach a wide variety of audiences.
Benefits to advertising on the Dyslexia Duo podcast include direct access to a diverse audience of parents, caregivers, and educators, association with experts in the field. Also, continuous traffic to the podcast means repeated exposure to your brand. You will be supporting a small business that advocates for children's education and options available to obtain measurable results.
Just contact us either through Facebook at The Dyslexia Duo or through email, thedyslexiaduo@gmail.com.
Thank you.
Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Amy.
So we just finished an interview with Sue Hegland, the author of Beneath the Surface of Words, What English Spelling Reveals and Why It Matters.
Oh my gosh, that was such good information. I had no idea that morphology was such a big deal in spelling.
Well, and I think it's going to actually change the way I instruct my students a little bit. I can go beyond the phonology. I can go beyond the graphemes. I'm going to start to pull in some of the morphological pieces and even the etymology.
There you go.
Of language.
Would you say you could go beneath the surface of words?
Oh my gosh, you are so witty. Yes, I could. I could.
Thank you. I can't wait for our listeners to learn about this incredible process that she has set up for us too.
And I know we don't do video, but even Sue said, "Oh my gosh, Amy, your face," because it was like the dawning of the age of Aquarius going over my face. I'm just coming to all kinds of realizations as I'm listening to her. So let's talk a little bit about who Sue is. So Sue Hegland is an educator, author, and frequent speaker on topics related to spelling. She began her career doing research and instructional design, but her focus shifted in 2003 when she learned one of her children is dyslexic, and she was trained in OG approaches to literacy instruction. She's been studying and teaching about orthographic linguistics since 2014. She served on the board of directors for the Upper Midwest branch of IDA and the Board of Education for Brandon Valley School District. And she's the editor-in-chief for the IDA's fact sheet publications.
And you will want to look her up at learningaboutspelling.com.
That's right. She did talk about that.
She has further resources on her page as well.
So if you haven't gotten her book, I mean, you don't have to have it to listen to the podcast, but if you haven't gotten her book, you're going to want to get it. She said you could get it off of Amazon. And we learned so much despite all the audio difficulties we were having. So if we sound a little slow in spots, it's because we had a little echo going on while we were talking.
Please forgive us.
So here it is. Here's Sue Hegland. Thanks a lot, y'all. Hi, this is Amy.
And Melissa. We are a couple of retired Texas teachers who are CALTs, Certified Academic Language Therapists. We started our own businesses, and now we have a podcast called The Dyslexia Duo.
So join us for our informative podcast, where we'll delve into dyslexia, covering the topics that affect parents, therapists, teachers, practitioners, and anyone who wants to learn more. We'll guide you through everything you need to know, from the first signs to the intricacies of dyslexia curriculum placement and beyond.
This season, we will cover the referral process, what to expect when your child or student is dyslexic, the generational impacts of dyslexia, and how to support those affected.
Come join us! Today, we have with us a very special guest. We have Sue Hegland, who I actually have your book. I recommend it to the teachers that I train. It's on their book report list. So I'm really excited that you're here. And your friend, Dr. Kelly Sandman Hurley, was on our show, and she said your book was fabulous. And she said that you needed to be a guest on our show and all of it.
She's wonderful. So I really appreciate that recommendation from her. She's I love what she does and her work, and so that's really nice.
She's very kind. She spoke very highly of you. So if you would, we have a large audience. We have teachers, we have dyslexia therapists, we have decision makers, we have parents. Go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience and just where you live, things you've written, things like that.
I would be happy to do that. And I'm going to start from the perspective of dyslexia, because you are the dyslexia duo. And that is really, I'm glad to be here to talk to you about dyslexia, because that's how I got into the work that I do now, is through learning that our oldest son is dyslexic. And we did not learn that until he was 11 years old.
Wow.
And I'll tell you the story if you don't mind, but he was because I think people need to understand more about dyslexia. And I'm hoping this is part of what your audience would be interested in knowing, because he completely slipped through the cracks, despite having wonderful teachers who were trying to look out for him, parents who were very involved. But he was a smartest little kid, knew every dinosaur name that had ever been, every dinosaur that roamed the earth. By the time he was 3, he was correcting me on their names. He had great vocabulary, went to school, wasn't so excited about school because this reading thing was kind of hard and spelling. And he ended up in first grade, he was in a school that was using reading recovery. And they looked at the class, and he was in kind of a combination class. There were like a class and a half worth of first graders, and he was in the bottom quarter of that class. So he was identified as needing reading recovery, and he did that for about a semester, and he improved, but he never really got to where it seemed like he should be, given how bright he was and his vocabulary and all that. But he kind of struggled through. And then second grade, we moved to a school that was doing what we would call today structured literacy sort of teaching. He got a lot more phonics instruction. He sort of figured things out. By third grade, he was like reading like mad. And he was the kid who always had his nose in a book. But he still couldn't spell. He still couldn't write. Fourth grade was really hard. He wasn't getting his written work done. By the beginning of fifth grade, we're thinking something doesn't make sense here. This kid can read anything, but he cannot get his written work done. He can't spell. We had him tested. And what was fascinating to me is that if you asked this child to read a passage, he was reading at a 10th grade level. Wow. So he looked on the surface like he was this fabulous reader, and he read all the time. But if you gave him a list of words, it was at a 6th grade level. And his spelling was at a 3rd grade level. And I think that was generous, because his spelling was really nothing. And his phonemic awareness in 5th grade, reading at theoretically a 10th grade level, was at the 1st grade level. So he did not have the foundational skills. He didn't understand. He had a lot of problems with phonemic awareness. And so he was never identified until he was 11. And so at that point, his school was wonderful. And they said, we would love to do anything we can help him, but he doesn't really qualify for any help because he's reading fine, right? Yeah. So we ended up homeschooling him. I homeschooled him. My husband supported that. And I stayed home and homeschooled him for several years, along with our other kids. Because as long as we were going to be home, we made it kind of a fun thing. And although it was a lot of work, we used a Norton Gillingham-based program with him, and I started learning everything I could about effective reading instruction and dyslexia. I got involved with the International Dyslexia Association branch in our area, the Upper Midwest branch. I'm in Minnesota, but I was in South Dakota at the time, and the branch covers both areas. And so I joined their board. I joined our school board. I ran for school board and was on the Board of Education for 6 years, and just got more and more involved. And then along the way, I thought, there are so many kids that need tutoring. I think I'm going to get trained in Norton Gillingham myself. So I started doing that. And along the way, I got very interested in understanding more about how to really support kids with spelling. And that's kind of how I got to where I am now. And the work I do now is really about helping teachers understand more about how the English spelling system works. Teachers, I think, are much better equipped to figure out how to implement in the classroom. I can't tell you how many times I give a talk and I'm thinking, I hope these teachers are going to find this useful because I'm not really giving them any activities. I'm just explaining things about how spelling works. And they come up afterwards and say, oh, I have so many things I'm going to do on Monday. I know how this is going to help this student. So it's really the understanding of the system that enables teachers, empowers teachers to go back and support their students. And that's the kind of work that I do these days.
I think so often we have parents that do something like you did out of a necessity for their own child. And I think a lot of people are going to be able to relate to that statement. I mean, they may not be writing a book about spelling, but they're going to relate totally to the need that you just expressed. So I appreciate that you shared that with us.
So I have a question to kind of follow up with what you explained to us. What do you think helped your son become such an avid reader, even though he had this underlying dyslexia?
That's a really good question. And there's a category of kids. I remember seeing, I think it's Fumiko Heft is how her name is pronounced. She's a researcher. And she gave a talk at an IDA conference down in San Diego, I think it was, about what she described as resilient readers. And she talked, and sometimes they're called stealth dyslexics. And the concept is that some students, some children are able to learn enough about the system and they get really good at, everyone as they learn to read has to have words become automatized. Someone who's not dyslexic, a typical reader might see a word 3 or 4 or 5 times. And then it's like they don't have to decode it. They just see the word. They know what it is. Mm-hmm. For someone who's dyslexic, that might take a lot longer. But I think some dyslexic students are able to get enough of that automatization of words that they can kind of get the gist. And I know he read every Animorphs book that was ever written. So there's like a predictable plot. There's a lot of the same vocabulary that you kind of know what's coming in. He got enough exposure that I think he became a pretty decent reader, but he would still mix up country and county and other things like that. He would leave out the function words, but he was taught, and I hate to say this, but he was taught in reading recovery how to get the gist of something by looking at the context and and he got really good at that. And I honestly think that sort of teaching masked what was going on underneath for longer than it would have if he had been, taught to read in a different way, where he was really taught to look at each and every letter, every grapheme on the page and understand what's going on with those words. So he became a strong reader, again, on the surface, but there were definitely issues there that he had to overcome.
So it's possible, too, that he could have had a strong orthographic mapping system as well.
Well, possibly. But the thing that's interesting is he was terrible at spelling words like says and does and said. And I remember how hard it was to get him to learn those words. In fact, I thought, well, I'm homeschooling him. I may not be that skilled, but I will make sure that this child, before the weekend, we're going to learn this word. And it just didn't take. And what I think is interesting is that today he is a mechanical engineer and he builds things, and he understands structures. And so if I could have just said to him, says is S-A-Y, which is completely encodable and decodable. And S you add, just like you do with play and plays, stay and stays, say and says. And isn't interesting that the pronunciation changes, but the spelling is completely understandable. He would not have had any trouble if I could have explained that to him. And does is D-O plus E-S. It's that same E-S that you see in splashes and catches. Yeah. And you know how to sound it out in those words. You just put them together and now you can spell the word. But I didn't know that. And his teachers didn't know that. So he had some ability, I think, Melissa, to do some orthographic mapping, but there were also things that he just did not stick. And part of it too is I think one of the important things with spelling is accurate practice. So because those words were probably practiced when he didn't really understand them and he would sometimes get them right and he would sometimes get them wrong. He could read them, but to have a strong enough, orthographic image in his mind or memory that he could put them on the paper when he was worried, he's working and he's thinking about other things. That was really a tough tough thing for him.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing your story about him.
Yeah. Hopefully he doesn't mind when I tell the story.
How old is he now?
He's 31 and he just got married.
Oh,
That's right. You were coming back from a wedding, weren't you?
Yep.
When we started corresponding. I remember that now.
Interesting.
exciting.
So let's talk a little bit about the English language. I can remember that many teachers telling our students that, English is illogical and you're just going to have to memorize these words. So do you think English is logical, illogical for spelling, and why?
I think it is extremely logical. And the reason that we all, including me, have thought that it is illogical is because we're thinking about spelling as having only one purpose, and that is to represent the pronunciation of a word in written form. And certainly that's part of what spelling does. But there's a lot more going on in the spelling system that we didn't know about. And once we understand that, then it makes a lot more sense. And the example I just gave you of, say, says and does would be two examples. Because if I'm going to try to spell the word says, and I want to teach a child to spell that, and I start with the phonemes, and I'm sure your audience is hearing phonemes, and we can make sure everybody knows what that is, but those are basically those smallest parts of the spoken word that are distinctive for meaning. So if I have fish and I change that to dish, the at the beginning, that's a phoneme. That's something that changes the meaning of a word. And so we have these phonemes in spoken words, and we have graphemes, or letters or combinations of letters in written words, and those have a correspondence. So if you look at a word like fish, it seems completely logical. Fish, F-I-S-H, we're good to go. And about 50% of words in English, there's an older study that indicated that about 50% of words in English, you could just have that kind of one-to-one correspondence. But the other half do not. And that's a big percentage, right? It's not like there's only about 4%. It's half the word. So for a student who's not sure how to spell a word, it's like, is this one of the ones that I just go one-to-one, or is this one of the other ones? So nothing is clear, right? If you're just trying to remember. So once we understand that there are these structures in words, like a base, S-A-Y, that makes the word say, and then a suffix that we add to it, that concept is incredibly important. And it's important from the very beginning of instruction. That's known as morphology. And so there's more and more recognition of how important morphology is. And the reason is it helps us understand why one particular grapheme, letter or combination of letters, is used to spell a particular pronunciation in this word and a different one in that word, because these spelling units, these morphological elements that spell words, are spelled consistently, even when the pronunciation is changing of those. So that is an important concept. And then the other thing to know is that there are other signals in words that help us quickly comprehend when we are reading, that make it easy for us when we see a word to know exactly what that word is. And those sometimes have to do with pronunciation, but they don't always have to do with pronunciation. And so once we start looking at more of the things that are going on in the spelling system, the logic of it, the coherence of it becomes so much clearer.
And maybe even understanding the origin could help with spelling as well.
It can, understanding the origin. Now, I want people to understand how to use that, because one of the things is, for example, sometimes kids are told, well, this word is spelled this way and it's French. And now they have to remember that it's spelled that way and it's French. It doesn't really help them understand it.
Yeah.
But by looking into the history, we can often understand why the word is spelled the way it is and connect it to something that they can understand. I can give you an example if that's helpful. So I had a student who misspelled the word bacon, and I learned so much from it. So he wrote B-A-C-I-N, bacon, right? So he got the C, but then he followed it with an I, and you would know what he would be getting wrong there, right?
Right.
Because if you were writing a C followed by an I, it's going to be pronounced not K, right? Probably S or Sh. But anyway, so he didn't remember that convention, but it made sense if he's just trying to sound it out to put an I there. And I'm thinking, why is there an O at the end of bacon? We don't say bacon, bacon. We just say bacon, right? First of all, it's kind of not emphasized, but I wanted to understand if rather than just say, well, it's schwad, it's that neutral vowel. You just have to remember that it's an O. Was there something that could help him understand it? So I went off and I, on my own, did a little bit of research, and I found out that word came from French. And I found all these words from French that end in an O-N, and there were lots and lots of them. I have a list here because I was thinking if you guys were asking about spelling, this would be a fun story to tell you. But words like bacon, salmon, melon, lemon, apron, gallon. Now, all those words connect to a particular topic, right? Think melon and lemon. It's all about food or cooking, right? We got apron. Then there are others like prison and reason and season that don't have anything to do with cooking. But at the very least, I thought, I think it's very interesting that all these words that are food and cooking related come from French. And I thought, think about, we get the word chef from French, So I think about how I was talking to my student about how we have lots of French cooking is really good. And we've learned a lot about French cooking. So these words, lemon and melon and salmon and bacon and apron, they all come from French, and they all spell that N at the end with an O-N. So that was something he could think about that was meaningful, where he could come back to it and remember, oh yeah, those are those French words that end in O-N that have to do with cooking. And if we wanted to anchor it with something where it's a French word where you pronounce that O, the word coupon also comes from French, right? With that O-N a little bit stronger. Bonbon, right? So we've got that O-N at the end. So that is an example of how I would use the history of a word and the relationships between words to help make something meaningful for a student so they don't have to just memorize it. Now, we're not going to do that for every single word we come across, right? You can't do that. But I learned a lot, and there were a lot of words that I could connect for students that had that difficult to sound out O-N spelling at the end. And that became something that I could continue using with students, and my students could remember.
I kind of love that because I can remember just a couple of weeks ago, I gave a student the word apron to spell. And then I gave them what I call a spelling pronunciation. I was like, so the word in running speech is apron, but when you spell it, it's apron, so that they could unblend it and then spell it correctly. But I love giving that history that you just said to kind of support that a little bit more, because I have kids all the time that say, why? And I don't always have the answer when it comes up for something like that.
Right. And neither do I, right? None of us do. But the other thing is, I think about also using the word coupon. Mm-hmm. So instead of apron, think about coupon, because the students that are going to have trouble remembering the spelling may also have trouble remembering a pronunciation that they would never use again, right? So apron might be harder for it, but if you give them coupon or bonbon or crayon, which they already know, and those also come from French with that O-N, then that's meaningful. And they don't have to kind of remember another pronunciation. They can just remember the connection between the words. So
I can see Melissa's wheels are turning.
I'm sitting over here feeling for where the syllables are. And if it's the accented syllable or the unaccented syllable.
Yeah, so those are all unaccented, those words. Yeah, so they just kind of are that neutral vowel, coupon.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
Hi, this is Melissa with Kids First Dyslexia Services. I am excited to share with you my private practice. Kids First Dyslexia Services is a private practice that specializes in dyslexia therapy. Each one-on-one session focuses on instruction specific to your child's needs in a nurturing environment that develops self-esteem, builds confidence, and fosters a sense of accomplishment, resulting in happier kids with higher levels of achievement. We provide a professional, personalized experience, always putting the child first. We value the relationships with both our students and parents, because strengthening skills and overcoming hurdles to achieve desired goals and success is a team effort. For more information, please visit www.kidsfirst www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com. That is www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com.
Hi there. This is Amy Rodenroth, owner of Discovery Dyslexia Services. So tell me if any of these situations are familiar to you. Your dyslexia teacher / therapist has suddenly retired unexpectedly, and you do not have the personnel to fill the space. Or you do not have enough trained teachers or therapists for the number of students who have qualified for dyslexia services, and you need a trained teacher or therapist quickly, like yesterday quickly. Or you need a teacher to provide compensatory services, and you do not have anyone that can provide what's needed. Well, what do you do? I'm going to tell you what you can do. You can call Discovery Dyslexia Services. Discovery Dyslexia Services can help you with your various dyslexia concerns. We have multiple CALTs who can provide virtual small group therapy. We can also train your teachers in most dyslexia curricula, either virtually or on site. Just let us know how we can help support you. For more information, go to our website at www.discovereed.com. Let me spell that for you. DYSCOVEREAD.com. I don't know, it's a funny name, but we're providing huge services for our dyslexic population. So keep in mind, Discovery Dyslexia Services, covering all your dyslexia needs. Let's return to the show.
So leading into my next question, thinking about that, those of us in the structured literacy dyslexia instruction realm teach according to the sound, unblend, and attach certain pre-taught graphemes to those sounds, or the phonemes, along with the spelling procedures. Often, this is not enough to guarantee success or carryover in spelling. So what else, as structured language therapists, dyslexia therapists, what else could we do to support our students in spelling?
Well, the process that you're describing, that process of teaching kids to take apart a spoken word, identify the phonemes, and then associate it with the grapheme, that is a very important set of skills. And kids need to learn how to do that. They have to be able to, when they're looking at a word, they can, identify the graphemes, blend the sounds together. But they also need to be thinking about how that's going to work with a limited set of words. And then there's this kind of framing it so that you as the teacher are helping them practice that as appropriate, but also not setting the expectation that that's how the whole system works. And so as you come across words where you think, well, wait a minute, that's not going to work that way. You want to help kids understand what's going on and why. And so one of the things I say is that morphology is the foundation of the system. And I don't say it's the foundation because it's the most important part, because obviously we also have to teach phonemes and graphemes. I say it's the foundation because it's the part that's stable. So if you have these morphemic elements that are spelled the same, even when the pronunciation is changing, so I have a word like cave, and then I add a suffix and it becomes cavity. Or I have a word mage, like what kids know about a mage in like magical stories. And mage, when you add an IC suffix, becomes magic. So the pronunciation is going to be changing, but the spelling is stable and predictable. So one of the things to be thinking about is, how can I teach kids words by starting with their spelling and understanding their spelling and priming them to always be looking for those morphological structures. And we start that early on with the inflectional suffixes, the ed suffix, the s suffix, ing, those kinds of things. But telling kids there are going to be more and more of these that we put onto base elements. We call them a base element as opposed to like a base word or root or anything like that. I think base element is a nice clean term for a morphological structure in a written word. And then you're going to be adding and taking off these prefixes and suffixes, and that's going to help you understand spelling. And as you get kids ready for that, they're going to be able to learn more and more words and word families, words that use single base, and you can spell all kinds of different words with it.
That's fascinating. I definitely need to buy your book.
I'm just going to let her borrow it right here.
I'll read it while you guys are talking.
It walked through a lot of these same examples and points, Melissa, that I want people to be able to think about. And I wrote the book to kind of help people see, step by step, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. That makes sense. Because it's a new way of thinking about how the spelling system works. It's not completely new, but it's a little bit different than we often think about how written words are supposed to do.
Well, you're exactly right. When I think about my instruction, I think about how I will teach a kid how to sound out a word, teach them the rules or whatever. And I'll sit there and say, but this doesn't always happen. If you see it this way, it's going to be this. So you're exactly right. And I totally agree with you in that aspect. But it is a little bit of a different thought process as far as the instruction is concerned, in my opinion.
It is. And it's one of the things that I like to talk to teachers about is that this can become, in a sense, a framework that you put around all the other important things that you are doing. And the more as a teacher you know about it, the more you're able to bring it into your instruction and figure out how that's going to make sense for your students. The goal that I have is to have as many kids as possible understand the spelling of words rather than having to memorize them. And even memorizing a part of a word is often very difficult, as we know. So the more we can help kids understand all of it, the better. And you can't do that with every single word in the entire language, but you can get a lot farther than we might think by understanding morphology and understanding the other purposes of graphemes in written words that might have nothing to do with pronunciation.
So what about spelling and understanding syllable types? Why is that important for spelling? Because we've talked about phonemes, we've talked about graphemes, we've talked about morphology, we've talked a little bit about origin of words. Do you think, I'm sure you do, spelling instruction should include syllable types, but why is that important for spelling?
Well, kids need to understand and teachers need to understand about syllables, but there is a lot less that we need to focus on than we might think. It's important to be able to, in a sense, count syllables. And, Melissa was like thinking about the syllables and where was the stress, and understanding where the stress is in a word is very important, especially as we add suffixes onto a base. And then we're going to figure out, do we double that final consonant? The 3 suffixing conventions we have. So there's certain things there that we need to understand. And then sometimes I'm going to call them the sequences of letters that people are recognizing as syllables, like a TION or an SION. Having a student understand that a T followed by an ION is going to be pronounced in a certain way, that can be very helpful. But the problem we want to be careful of is that's not a suffix. And Oxford English Dictionary lists TION and SION as suffixes, but then it also says the origin is this ION suffix, and they also list an ION suffix. And they're a little bit mixed up about it, as we all have been in the culture, because in truth, TION and SION are not suffixes. So we want to be careful not to mix that up, because we want kids to be looking at new words that they haven't seen before and see if they can recognize something in front of that ION that they maybe are familiar with. If they include the T and the S, that sort of pulls off part of the base so they can't see it. Like if I'm looking at the word ignition and I think, oh, there's an ION. So I have IGNIT, ignite, ignition, and they are related. But if I take off the T, I've got IGNI. Well, I don't know what that means, right? So I don't see a connection there that's going to allow me to maybe recognize that word. So Devin Kearns has done work on syllable division as well, and has shown that there isn't maybe as much predictability as we had seen before. So I think as teachers get more comfortable with morphology as a way to analyze words and teach kids how to make sense of words, the need for syllable division is a little bit less. And there are teachers who move away from it completely. I didn't do very much with it in, the last few years. I haven't done much with it. I don't find it as useful as morphological analysis for what I'm doing with kids.
That's interesting. One of the things When I work with a student for spelling, so we go through a process and I'll say the word and then I want to make sure they're saying the same word I say. They echo it, they unblend the sounds, they name the letters, they name and write. So that's been a really great process for most of our kids for spelling, but it's not always enough, Outside of going into word origin and word meaning, what else can I do to support them with that?
What sort of words are you talking about? Like, give me an example of a couple of words.
Oh, my goodness. I just did this today with a student, and he was not getting the rules when it was a doubling. Like when it's a base word that ends in a short vowel consonant and he adds a vowel suffix, right?
Right.
Or if it's a vowel consonant E, does he drop the E before attaching the vowel suffix? Cookies could, yeah, that could be one. But it's not, base word is cookie, C-O-K-K.
So first of all, you're doing a really good thing by teaching kids to use those 3 suffixing conventions. First of all, that's really important. And I sometimes hear people talking about how they think that is too much cognitive load for kids, that we shouldn't. And I don't understand that at all, because we have 3 suffixing conventions, as you say, the doubling rule, the drop the E rule,
and the
then
changing.
Y to I. So once kids learn those 3, and it does take some practice to get fluent with them and comfortable with them. But once kids learn those, they're going to use them over and over and over again. And often the E convention, especially, I call it the E convention just because I like the word convention personally, because the reason is that when we have a convention, it's something we do unless we have a good reason to do something else, right? We might have a convention that I shouldn't run in the room and start yelling at you. But if there was a tornado that was approaching, I probably should come in and, right? So whereas a rule is like, you don't ever want to break that. And so I like the idea of convention because it helps kids think about it as, well, there's a reason we do that, but we have to think about why. Like, why are we doing that? And are there times where we don't? So you want to teach kids those 3 suffixing conventions, and it does take practice. But what I would suggest is you can also think about showing kids the spelling and maybe analyzing the spelling before you ask them to take it apart based on the pronunciation.
Okay.
So you put the word, in a sense, because pronunciation is so flexible, there are going to be lots of different things that are going on that could be confusing to kids. I'll give you an example. And this starts to come into play. So we're setting kids up, I think, we want to set kids up to understand these concepts that are going to become more and more important as they get further and further along. So when a student is very young, early in their years, they're going to have to learn how to write equals, right? 2 + 2 = 4. And that's going to be a spelling word that they're going to have to somehow understand. There's a base. I always thought about it as equal as just a word, right? There was nothing more to that than just that word, but it's actually a base, EQU, and then a suffix AL. And that suffix AL is making it an adjective. We have an equal sum, right? Same thing we have in normal or formal. And so by teaching a word as simple as that, 2 syllables, by saying, look, here's the structure. And then maybe we can even start talking about words that are related or that have that same base, like equal, and then we get equation. And kids start to learn how we have that AL suffix that shows up all over the place. We have an ATE suffix. We have an ION suffix. So we're teaching spelling by starting with these structures that are going to be put in lots and lots of different words. And the suffixes and the prefixes, there aren't nearly as many of those as there are of bases. Once you understand the prefixes and suffixes, you can then start putting new bases in and learning the spelling of words very quickly and easily because you already know kind of all the parts that go around the base.
Love that, because that makes so much more sense. And even you saying that cognitive load part, that makes sense to me because we separate the base word from the suffix. We write the base word, we write the suffix, and then we go through our derivative rules, and it just seems like a lot after a while. They can go through the rules, but then they may not be able to apply it to the word
No.
that they're writing still, you know?
Well, one of the things I would recommend you look at is this tool called a word sum and a matrix. Have you heard
I
about those?
have.
So a word sum can be very powerful when you're trying to teach kids how to spell and how to use those three suffixing conventions. And as you said, it can be a lot of cognitive load for them to keep all that stuff in their head. So a word sum allows them to write it down on paper and then work through it piece by piece. So I'm going to give you an example of, let's say we have the word hopping that they want to write. So we have an HOP base, we write that down, a plus sign, and then ING. And then we do a little rewrite arrow. It looks like an arrow. It is rewritten as. Now they have to go back and check for any changes. So they're going to be able to say, okay, so I know I have a vowel suffix. Okay. And I can see that I have that single consonant and I have that single vowel. And then they can mark the word sum and then they rewrite the word. Because and maybe that's the kind of thing that you have them do already, but putting it down on paper and letting them have a process to go through is very helpful. And then they can also take whatever base they're working with and they can create a matrix. And a matrix is something where you have a base and then what we call an orthographic denotation, kind of a deep sense that's carried in that base. And you can put suffixes after it, prefixes before it. I'll send you a link to something I wrote that would be maybe helpful for people to understand
Wonderful.
morphological awareness and getting started with it. So the matrix then is a way for us to represent, let's say we've got that EQU base. The first time a child encounters the word equals, I could have a little banner goes down the middle. It's like a column with EQU written in it. And then what's called the orthographic denotation, which is in this case, something like even or fair. So when something is equal, an equal sign, it's even on both sides, right?
Okay.
It's equal. But we also end up then adding new words. As kids get older, we can add more words. And so we have equation. So that's the EQU plus an ATE suffix and then an ION suffix. And we replace that. Here's another example of that final E where we replace the ION. And an equation is something, again, where it's equal on both sides. And kids will know the word equation. They learn that pretty early on, but they may not know the word equate. That is, in a sense, like more of a tier 3 word, maybe a tier 2 word, whereas equation, well, that's probably a tier 2 word because kids don't come to school knowing the word equation, but they learn it very early on. But equate is a little higher register, right? It gets used as kids get older in more formal academic language. So they are ready to begin putting all these words together. And then eventually they can learn a word like equivalent or equivocal, which also use that same EQU base and then start combining other bases. So it gives you a way to begin building vocabulary. I've done a lot of work with talking to teachers about how a matrix and working with a morphological family, a set of words that share a base element, can really build vocabulary very organically. As kids get older, this is really helpful. And so if you have the word insect, we would teach kids what an insect is, and that's easily encodable and decodable. You can look at the syllables, it's really easy. But the base is SECT, which has this idea of cut. It's also in words like section and sector and bisecting. And when we think about what an insect is, what makes an insect an insect? Well, it has those 3 parts in the body, right? And the reason it's called an insect is the ancient Romans thought, well, these were cut into, right? Because you look at it, it's almost like it's cut in. So there's concept development, there's vocabulary development, and you can do a lot with teaching and reading when you start with these morphological families.
I kind of love all this because this is kind of showing that reading and spelling aren't taught in isolated silos. They're taught together.
Exactly. Yeah. And I know you two were at the IDA National Conference last week. And one of the themes that was just coming out over and over in that conference was the importance of integrated instruction. We want to teach phonics and morphology and integrate them together. We want to teach phonemic awareness and phonics and integrate that together. Vocabulary and background knowledge. It's not teach for 10 minutes on this topic and then 15 minutes on this topic. It's how do you bring all of that together? And the thing about this type of study is it brings so much together. Comprehension, vocabulary. You can build background knowledge. You're working on the phoneme grapheme relationships, the phonemic awareness. So it's really exciting. And it really does fit with that goal of structured literacy.
Okay, so We've talked a lot about the word morphology. And we've had Drs. Kelly Sandman Hurley talking about morphology and how important it is. I like to think about the listeners, and if they didn't listen to any of our other episodes, but they wanted to hear your episode about spelling and beneath the surface of words, and they didn't know anything about morphology. Could you explain a little bit about morphology? What is a morpheme to start with?
Okay, so morphology is this field of linguistics, and it applies to education, and it's about the structures that build words. And we have these, they're called morphemes, and that's this term for these units that we use to put words together. And morphemes occur in both spoken language and written language. So, a child will say run, and then they learn to say running. I am running. And they might then eventually say, I runned home really fast, Mom, right? Why do they say runned instead of ran? Well, they understand that for most words, we add this suffix in our spoken language. We say, I liked, I played, I runned, and they are generalizing what they're just absorbing from the language. And that is morphology. It is these structures that build words. Now, what's interesting is in spoken language, it's actually harder to see the morphology than it is in the written language. Because, for example, with that ed suffix that's on words like played and planted and walked, if I say played, I'm going to pronounce that ed suffix as just d. If I say planted, it's kind of id. If I say walked, it's t. But we spell it the same. And so that concept, which every teacher knows and teaches, it applies across so much more of the system than we might realize. And that is morphology. That is understanding these structures that we put together to build words.
Great. And then what age do you believe morphology instruction should begin?
I think it should begin as soon as we start talking to kids about phonemes and graphemes, sounds and symbols. The reason is English is actually defined as a morphophonemic language. In other words, when you hear the word walked, you are perceiving a phoneme at the end, walked, right? So you're hearing the phoneme, but you're also perceiving a morpheme. You know that walk and walked, oh, that's past tense. I walked home earlier. And so as speakers of the language, we are processing both phonemes, these sounds, and morphemes, these meaningful units at the same time. So we want to prep kids to see that. And it can be very simple. The thing that I'll send you that you can share with your listeners is an article that I wrote on getting started with this idea, because it's as simple as when you're teaching kids about words like hat and bag, right? They're learning how to encode and decode these CVC words, hat, bag. You can put a little matrix up on the wall with HAT and then a little line and then an S, and then BAG and a little line and then S, and say, look, we're learning the bases now, but soon we're going to start learning about prefixes and suffixes. And look what happens with hats and bags. How do we pronounce that last phoneme in hats, right? Hat. And how about bags? Ooh, it's a Z and it's us. But look, it's spelled the same. We use the S for both. And we're going to see that happen a lot. So now we can go back to our, CVC words, but we're setting kids up to understand it. And as soon as we come to some of the words like says, does, been, B-E-E-N, we can begin to introduce morphology, because that will help students understand and spell those accurately. It becomes more and more important as you go along, but you want to start by priming the students to see this and be aware that it's part of the system.
So really just preschool age, you could even start doing that.
With preschoolers, and you can do it in oral language. You can just talk to them about, how we put words together, and there's different word parts, and they can begin to understand that.
This completes part 1 of our conversation with Sue Hegland. Join us next week for the conclusion to this interview. The Dyslexia Duo podcast hosts are Amy Rodenroth,
Melissa Dean.
Our producer is Greg Rodenroth.
You can find us on Facebook at The Dyslexia Duo.
Email us any questions or comments at thedyslexiaduo@gmail.com. dyslexia.com.
Awareness is so important. Share this podcast with your friends,
Family,
and teachers.
thanks for joining us.
Bye.